Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark stood on the sidewalk outside the bistro, the cold rain still falling heavily around him. He stared down at the business card Eleanor had given him, the elegant gold lettering shining through the droplets. The weight of her offer hung heavily in the air. Marry her. It was ridiculous, right? But then again, what else did he have? His debts were piling up, his future was uncertain, and his family's financial struggles seemed endless. He had no other choice but to consider it. As Mark walked home that evening, the rain splashing beneath his feet, his mind kept returning to Eleanor's words. She had spoken with such confidence, as if the arrangement was something he couldn't refuse. And in a way, he couldn't. If he didn't accept, what would happen to him? What would happen to his family? He hadn't been able to save his father from his debts. Could he save himself? Eleanor's offer was tempting, but something in him resisted. This wasn't the life he had imagined for himself. Marriage? For convenience? It felt wrong on so many levels. But then again, was it any worse than the life he was living now? At least, with her, there was a way out. His mind raced as he approached the small apartment he shared with his mother. The sound of her voice echoed through the building as he climbed the stairs. When he entered, his mother was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly together, worry etched on her face. She looked up as he walked in, her eyes tired but hopeful. Mark didn't answer right away. He tossed his backpack onto the couch and sat down across from her, his mind still spinning from the meeting with Eleanor. He thought about telling her everything, but something stopped him. He wasn't sure he could explain it yet. How could he tell her that he had just been offered a way out of their struggles, but at the cost of his own dignity? He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. His mother's eyes widened. Eleanor Brooks? The name meant nothing to Mark at first, but he could see his mother's reaction. It was one of surprise and curiosity. Mark hesitated for a moment, then exhaled deeply. He looked down at his hands before meeting her gaze. He could feel the weight of his next words. His mother didn't speak right away. She simply stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shrugged, his shoulders slumping. I don't have many options, Mom. I'm drowning in debt. We're drowning in debt. She says she can fix it. But, it feels wrong. I don't know if I can do it. I'm not sure what to do. His mother sat back, her hands folded in her lap. She seemed to consider the situation carefully, then reached out to touch his hand. Mark nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. He knew she was right. It wasn't just about him, this was about his mother, about his future. But could he really walk away from this? Could he refuse Eleanor's offer and risk losing everything they had left? He stood up, pacing the small living room. The next morning, Mark found himself standing in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. He had no idea what he was doing. How did he end up here, caught between pride and survival? The man in the mirror looked lost. He wasn't the confident, ambitious student he once was. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. But if marrying Eleanor could change everything for him, for his family, could he really say no? He took a deep breath and picked up the phone. He stared at the number Eleanor had given him. His finger hovered over the call button. He knew what he needed to do. This was his chance to escape. But was he willing to pay the price? Mark dialed the number. His heart raced as it rang, each second that passed making him question everything. Finally, she picked up. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself for what was about to come. He knew what he had to do. There was no going back. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Eleanor spoke again, her tone softer now. He hung up the phone, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What had he just agreed to? As he stood there, staring at the phone in his hand, he realized that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. A new chapter in his life was about to start, and he wasn't sure whether he was ready for either what the future would bring. Mark sat at his desk, staring at the contract Eleanor had sent him. The words blurred before his eyes as he tried to focus. He had agreed, but now, with the reality of it settling in, he felt the weight of his decision. Was this really the way out? Could he really go through with it? He had never imagined his life would come to this, a marriage of convenience, no love, just a contract. But what choice did he have? His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Eleanor. Mark, I've arranged everything. We're meeting tomorrow to finalize the details. The venue for the ceremony is set. I'll have the papers ready. I'll see you then. The message was short, but the finality of it made Mark feel like a weight was lifting off his shoulders, and yet something heavier was taking its place. He stood up from his desk, walking over to the small window in his apartment. The city stretched out before him, bustling and alive, completely unaware of the personal storm brewing inside him. Was this the life he wanted? Could he really pretend for the rest of his life that he was happy with this arrangement? That night, as Mark lay in bed, sleep wouldn't come. His mind raced, turning over everything Eleanor had said. She had offered him security, freedom from debt, a life where he didn't have to struggle every single day just to survive. But at what cost? His pride? His independence? His future? He couldn't shake the thought of what his friends would say. They didn't know the truth about his situation. Would they think he was weak? Would they understand? The next day, Mark met Eleanor at her office, the sleek, modern building towering over him as he approached. The polished glass doors opened as he entered, and he was greeted by her assistant, who led him into a conference room where Eleanor was already waiting. She was dressed in a tailored suit, sitting with a quiet authority. Mark felt small in comparison, as though he was stepping into a world he didn't belong to. "Mark, I'm glad you came," she said as he took a seat across from her. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. It made him feel like he was a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. "This is really happening, huh?" Mark said, his voice low. He couldn't hide the uncertainty in his tone. Eleanor's lips curled into a small smile. "Yes, it is. You've made the right decision, Mark. I know this isn't easy for you, but it's the best choice for both of us. Trust me." Mark looked at the papers in front of him. The contract. The marriage. The life he was about to enter. He could feel the weight of his decision settling heavily in his chest. He took a deep breath and signed the papers without looking up. As Eleanor slid the signed documents back to her, she stood up and walked around the table, stopping in front of him. "This is just the beginning, Mark. We'll be a team now. You'll have everything you need, and in return, I'll have what I need. A partnership, no strings attached, just mutual benefits." Mark stood up as well, his legs slightly shaking. The reality of it was sinking in. He was about to marry a woman he didn't know, for reasons that had nothing to do with love. This wasn't the future he had imagined for himself, but it was the only future he could afford. Eleanor reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch firm, confident. "You made the right choice, Mark. You'll see," she said softly. And for the first time in days, he almost believed her. Almost. Later that evening, Mark stood in front of his small mirror, adjusting his tie. The room felt too quiet, too empty. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but the alternative was worse. He took one last look at his reflection, trying to remind himself why he was doing this. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about romance. This was survival. He arrived at the venue just before the ceremony. The grand hall was filled with people, most of whom he didn't know. Eleanor had arranged everything: guests, a lavish setup, the perfect atmosphere. It felt surreal, like he was walking through a dream. But when he saw her, standing at the front, her eyes calm and steady, he knew that this was real. This was happening. The officiant began the ceremony, and Mark's mind wandered. He glanced at Eleanor, whose expression remained serene, almost unreadable. As the vows were exchanged, Mark realized how strange it felt. He wasn't saying these words out of love. He was saying them to secure a future, to escape a life of uncertainty. When the ceremony was over, and they were officially married, Eleanor took his arm, leading him into the reception. Mark couldn't help but notice how effortlessly she moved, how she seemed to command the room with just a glance. She was everything he wasn't: confident, powerful, in control. And here he was, a man who had just pledged his life to her, but only out of necessity, not choice. As the evening wore on, Mark tried to settle into his new reality. He knew this was the start of something new, but he wasn't sure what. He had committed to this path, but what lay ahead? What kind of future would this be for him? For her? The night ended with a soft goodbye from Eleanor as she disappeared into the crowd. Mark stood there, alone, feeling the weight of the marriage contract he had just entered. What had he gotten himself into? The days after the wedding passed in a blur of meetings, events, and formalities. Mark found himself adjusting to his new life, though nothing felt real. The grand hall, the lavish ceremony, it all felt like a distant dream. As time went on, the reality of his new life set in. He woke up each morning in a bed that wasn't his, ate breakfast in a home that didn't feel like home, and went to meetings that seemed to have no purpose beyond the arrangement he had made with Eleanor. He was her husband, in name only, and everything about this new life felt surreal. Mark had tried to settle into his role. He attended the meetings, played the part of the doting husband, and kept up appearances. But the emptiness he felt inside never went away. Eleanor had promised that everything would change, that he would have everything he needed, but as the days passed, he felt more and more like a stranger in his own life. Eleanor, however, seemed unaffected by it all. She was always calm, always in control, and as time went on, Mark couldn't help but notice how distant she remained. One evening, after another long day of events, Mark returned home to find the house empty. He dropped his briefcase by the door and walked through the large, quiet mansion. The walls seemed to echo his footsteps as he made his way through the grand hallway. He had been married for weeks now, and yet he still couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. It was late, but he couldn't sleep. He found himself in the library, flipping through books he didn't care about, the silence pressing down on him. The weight of the contract he had signed, the life he had agreed to live, was beginning to take its toll. He didn't want to feel this way. He had agreed to this, after all. He had signed the papers, and yet, something was missing. There was no warmth here, no connection. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, Eleanor walked in. She had just returned from a business dinner, her suit still sharp, her hair immaculate. She looked at him, a small smile on her lips, but there was a certain coldness in her eyes. "Mark, I didn't expect to find you here," she said, her voice cool but with an edge of curiosity. "Everything going well?" Mark looked up at her, forcing a smile. He had become good at pretending, at playing his role, but the weight of it was starting to show. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, his voice trailing off. "Just thinking." "Thinking?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "About what?" He hesitated. The truth was, he wasn't sure. He didn't know what he was searching for. He didn't know if he was still hoping for something more or if he was just trying to find a way out of this emptiness that had taken root in him. He looked at her, searching her face for some sign of warmth, but found none. "I don't know," he said quietly, standing up and walking towards the window. "I thought this arrangement would be different. That I'd feel something, anything. But it just feels empty." There was a long silence as Eleanor studied him. For a moment, Mark thought she might say something, but instead, she simply walked past him, taking a seat by the fire. "It's all part of the deal, Mark," she said, her voice low. "You knew what you were getting into. This was never meant to be about feelings or romance. It's about stability, security. A partnership. That's all." Mark turned to look at her. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had known this was the deal. He had signed up for this, after all, but hearing her say it so plainly made him question everything. "Yeah, I know," he replied, his voice tight. "I just thought. I don't know what I thought." He stood there for a moment, feeling the distance between them grow even wider. Eleanor's expression didn't change, and Mark could feel the coldness in the room. He had been hoping for some sign that this could be more, that somehow, some way, he could find a way to make this work. But it was clear now. This wasn't a love story. It was a business transaction, nothing more. "I'll go to bed," he said, his words quieter now. "Good night." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She simply nodded and watched him leave the room. Mark could feel the weight of her gaze on him as he walked away. It was then that he realized something wasn't just a stranger in her life. He was a stranger to himself now. This marriage, this contract, had consumed him, and he wasn't sure how much of the man he used to be was left. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Mark knew that this arrangement wasn't going to fix everything. It wasn't going to make him happy. It wasn't going to heal the wounds inside him. But he had made his choice. There was no turning back now. The next morning, as Mark prepared for another day in the life he had created, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still searching for something that Eleanor couldn't give him. And as the days stretched on, the emptiness only grew, leaving him wondering if he would ever find a way to fill it. Mark woke up the next morning feeling a heaviness in his chest that he couldn't shake. The silence of the grand house was overwhelming as he walked down the long hallway, the weight of the past few weeks pressing on him with each step. He had agreed to marry Eleanor, signed the contract, and accepted the life she offered. But now, as the days bled into each other, he couldn't help but feel more and more like a prisoner in a gilded cage. He still played the role attending events, holding up the pretense of a happy marriage, but something inside him felt lost. Something deep within him was yearning for more, even if he couldn't quite name it. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt, trying to make himself look presentable for another day of meetings and appearances. But this time, it felt different. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't the man he used to be. He didn't recognize himself. How had he gotten here? The man in the mirror was a stranger, someone who had given up a part of himself for the sake of survival. And for what? Security? A way out of debt? What was the cost of that kind of peace? Mark sighed, pushing away the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't afford to dwell on them. There was no turning back now. He had made a deal, and he had to honor it. Eleanor's world was nothing like his own. She was a force to be reckoned with, calm, confident, and powerful. She had everything together, everything in control. Mark, on the other hand, felt like a shadow of his former self, unsure of his place in the world, unsure of who he was anymore. When he finally made his way downstairs, Eleanor was already at the breakfast table, reading through some documents. She barely looked up as he entered the room, her expression focused and distant. She was always like that, business first, everything else second. "Morning," Mark said, his voice quieter than usual as he took a seat across from her. "Morning," Eleanor replied without looking up, her voice sharp, almost businesslike. We have a meeting with the board at noon. You'll need to be prepared for that. Mark nodded, trying to push away the frustration that had been building inside him. He wasn't sure why, but today felt different. Maybe it was the weight of the silence between them, or the realization that they were both living in a lie. He had agreed to the arrangement, but the more time passed, the more he felt like something was slipping away from him. "I'll be ready," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. But Eleanor didn't seem to hear him, lost in her papers. The day passed in a blur of meetings and formalities. Mark went through the motions, but his mind was elsewhere. He found himself thinking about the life he had left behind, the one where he had dreams, hopes, and ambitions. Now, all of that seemed distant, like a life that belonged to someone else. As the evening approached, Mark returned home to the mansion, his steps heavy with the weight of another day gone by. He entered the quiet house, expecting the usual emptiness. But this time, Eleanor was waiting for him, sitting on the couch in the living room, a rare look of seriousness on her face. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, her tone different from the usual coldness. It was still controlled, but there was an edge to it that Mark hadn't heard before. He sat down next to her, unsure of what to expect. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice cautious. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "You've been distant lately. Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Mark wasn't sure how to answer. He wanted to say something, to explain how he felt trapped in this arrangement, how he felt like he was losing himself in the process. But something stopped him. He had agreed to this. He had signed the papers. There was no room for complaints, no room for feelings. "I'm fine," Mark said, his words automatic. "Just tired, I guess." Eleanor didn't seem convinced. She studied him for a moment, as though trying to gauge whether he was telling the truth. Finally, she sighed. "Mark, you're not fine. And I know you're not happy with this arrangement. But we made a deal. You knew what this was going to be. I can't give you what you want. This was never about love. It was about security, and I'm keeping my end of the bargain." Mark looked at her, his heart heavy. "I know," he said softly, his voice thick with frustration. "But I didn't expect this emptiness. I didn't expect to feel like I was losing myself." Eleanor's gaze softened for a moment, but it quickly hardened again. "You knew this wasn't going to be easy, Mark. I'm doing what I have to do. And you agreed to it." Mark stood up, pacing the room. He couldn't sit still anymore. The weight of her words, the weight of the contract they had both signed, was crushing him. "I just don't know how much longer I can keep pretending," he muttered, more to himself than to her. There was a long silence before Eleanor spoke again. "You don't have to pretend for me, Mark. Just stay focused on the deal. We don't need anything more than that." Mark turned to look at her, feeling a pang of bitterness rise in his chest. He had agreed to this. He had made the choice. But now, more than ever, he wondered if it had been the right one. As Eleanor stood and walked past him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement was slowly destroying everything he had once hoped for. What had he sacrificed for security? For peace? And was it worth it? He didn't know the answers yet, but he knew that something had to change. And he was the only one who could make it happen. Mark spent the following days in a haze of frustration and confusion, each one blending into the next like a never-ending loop. Eleanor had been right in one way: it was easier to keep his distance, to stick to the deal and ignore the growing sense of emptiness inside him. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more suffocating it became. His mind kept returning to the question he had been avoiding: what had he truly given up for security? What was left of the person he used to be? He found himself waking up each day in a beautiful, quiet house that felt more like a museum than a home. The mansion was cold and sterile, with its high ceilings and polished floors, but the absence of warmth and life was impossible to ignore. Eleanor's presence, though commanding, never felt like a partner. She was a constant, and yet she felt so far away. There was no connection, no real intimacy between them. And it had only been a few weeks. Mark's thoughts were interrupted one morning as Eleanor called him into her office. The way she said his name, calm but direct, still sent a shiver through him. He stood in the doorway, watching her as she glanced up from her desk, her face unreadable as always. "Mark, I need you to take care of something," Eleanor said, her voice efficient as she handed him a folder. "We're attending a gala tomorrow night. I need you to make a good impression. These people are important. They'll be key to expanding the business, and I expect you to handle this with the professionalism we've discussed." Mark looked at the folder, his heart sinking. Another event. Another night spent pretending. He had come to dread these functions, where he was nothing more than a figurehead, a symbol of Eleanor's public life. He had played the part before, but now it felt even more hollow. "Of course," he said, his voice flat. "I'll handle it." "Good," Eleanor replied, her gaze returning to the paperwork in front of her. "Remember, Mark, this isn't just about appearances. You need to be part of the team. We agreed on this. The future depends on it." As Mark left her office, he couldn't help but feel that familiar weight in his chest, the pressure building with every word she said. Was this really what he had agreed to? Was this really the future he wanted for himself? He had never been one to shy away from hard work, but this wasn't work. This was survival. And survival didn't feel like living. The night of the gala arrived, and Mark found himself dressed in a tuxedo, standing in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie. He looked the part, well-groomed, poised, but he didn't feel it. The man staring back at him was a stranger. He had become someone else in this arrangement, someone who had no room for personal desires, no space for the things that used to matter. As he arrived at the event, Eleanor was already mingling with the guests, effortlessly commanding attention with her presence. She was the center of the room, the epitome of grace and control. Mark, on the other hand, felt like he was fading into the background, just another accessory to her carefully curated life. He tried to push down the feelings of inadequacy that threatened to rise up, but it was becoming harder to ignore. The night dragged on, the conversations were forced, and Mark found himself retreating into a quiet corner, away from the crowd. He was used to being alone in a crowd, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, it felt like he was drowning in a sea of people, unable to escape. As the event wound down, Mark caught sight of Eleanor again, standing near the exit, exchanging pleasantries with some of the most influential people in the room. He walked over, trying to put on a smile, to look the part. But as he approached, something in him shifted. The emptiness inside him that he had been avoiding, the quiet ache that had been growing stronger over the past few days, suddenly felt unbearable. "Eleanor," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She looked up at him, her expression still controlled, but there was something in her eyes that seemed to acknowledge the tension between them. "Mark," she said, her tone still as businesslike as ever. "Everything went well tonight, don't you think?"
"Yeah,
"Sure," he said, his words distant. "It was fine." There was a long pause as they stood there, surrounded by the fading chatter of the gala. Mark wanted to say more, to tell her how suffocating this all felt, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself taking a step back, distancing himself even further from her. "I'll see you at home," he said finally, his voice quiet. Eleanor nodded, her attention already shifting back to the crowd. Mark turned and walked away, his steps slow and heavy. The night felt like it had taken something from him, like a piece of himself had been chipped away with every passing minute. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly alive. As Mark left the gala and stepped out into the cool night air, he finally allowed himself to breathe. The weight of the evening lifted slightly, but the uncertainty remained. He had made his choice, but he wasn't sure anymore if it was the right one. He had agreed to the arrangement for the sake of security, for the chance to escape his past. But with every day that passed, it felt like the future he had hoped for was slipping further away, replaced by a life he wasn't sure he could accept. Mark looked up at the stars above, searching for some kind of answer, some sign that he wasn't lost. But all he could see was darkness, stretching out endlessly in front of him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: something had to change. Mark spent the following days in a haze of frustration and confusion, each one blending into the next like a never-ending loop. Eleanor had been right in one way: it was easier to keep his distance, to stick to the deal and ignore the growing sense of emptiness inside him. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more suffocating it became. His mind kept returning to the question he had been avoiding: what had he truly given up for security? What was left of the person he used to be? He found himself waking up each day in a beautiful, quiet house that felt more like a museum than a home. The mansion was cold and sterile, with its high ceilings and polished floors, but the absence of warmth and life was impossible to ignore. Eleanor's presence, though commanding, never felt like a partner. She was a constant, and yet she felt so far away. There was no connection, no real intimacy between them. And it had only been a few weeks. Mark's thoughts were interrupted one morning as Eleanor called him into her office. The way she said his name, calm but direct, still sent a shiver through him. He stood in the doorway, watching her as she glanced up from her desk, her face unreadable as always. "Mark, I need you to take care of something," Eleanor said, her voice efficient as she handed him a folder. "We're attending a gala tomorrow night. I need you to make a good impression. These people are important. They'll be key to expanding the business, and I expect you to handle this with the professionalism we've discussed." Mark looked at the folder, his heart sinking. Another event. Another night spent pretending. He had come to dread these functions, where he was nothing more than a figurehead, a symbol of Eleanor's public life. He had played the part before, but now it felt even more hollow. "Of course," he said, his voice flat. "I'll handle it." "Good," Eleanor replied, her gaze returning to the paperwork in front of her. "Remember, Mark, this isn't just about appearances. You need to be part of the team. We agreed on this. The future depends on it." As Mark left her office, he couldn't help but feel that familiar weight in his chest, the pressure building with every word she said. Was this really what he had agreed to? Was this really the future he wanted for himself? He had never been one to shy away from hard work, but this wasn't work. This was survival. And survival didn't feel like living. The night of the gala arrived, and Mark found himself dressed in a tuxedo, standing in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie. He looked the part, well-groomed, poised, but he didn't feel it. The man staring back at him was a stranger. He had become someone else in this arrangement, someone who had no room for personal desires, no space for the things that used to matter. As he arrived at the event, Eleanor was already mingling with the guests, effortlessly commanding attention with her presence. She was the center of the room, the epitome of grace and control. Mark, on the other hand, felt like he was fading into the background, just another accessory to her carefully curated life. He tried to push down the feelings of inadequacy that threatened to rise up, but it was becoming harder to ignore. The night dragged on, the conversations were forced, and Mark found himself retreating into a quiet corner, away from the crowd. He was used to being alone in a crowd, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, it felt like he was drowning in a sea of people, unable to escape. As the event wound down, Mark caught sight of Eleanor again, standing near the exit, exchanging pleasantries with some of the most influential people in the room. He walked over, trying to put on a smile, to look the part, but as he approached, something in him shifted. The emptiness inside him that he had been avoiding, the quiet ache that had been growing stronger over the past few days, suddenly felt unbearable. "Eleanor," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She looked up at him, her expression still controlled, but there was something in her eyes that seemed to acknowledge the tension between them. "Mark," she said, her tone still as businesslike as ever. "Everything went well tonight, don't you think?"
"Yeah."
"Sure," he said, his words distant. "It was fine." There was a long pause as they stood there, surrounded by the fading chatter of the gala. Mark wanted to say more, to tell her how suffocating this all felt, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself taking a step back, distancing himself even further from her. "I'll see you at home," he said finally, his voice quiet. Eleanor nodded, her attention already shifting back to the crowd. Mark turned and walked away, his steps slow and heavy. The night felt like it had taken something from him, like a piece of himself had been chipped away with every passing minute. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly alive. As Mark left the gala and stepped out into the cool night air, he finally allowed himself to breathe. The weight of the evening lifted slightly, but the uncertainty remained. He had made his choice, but he wasn't sure anymore if it was the right one. He had agreed to the arrangement for the sake of security, for the chance to escape his past. But with every day that passed, it felt like the future he had hoped for was slipping further away, replaced by a life he wasn't sure he could accept. Mark looked up at the stars above, searching for some kind of answer, some sign that he wasn't lost. But all he could see was darkness, stretching out endlessly in front of him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: something had to change. The days that followed the wedding were both surreal and suffocating for Mark. He found himself wandering through the vast, cold halls of Eleanor's mansion, a stranger in a life that was meant to secure his future. Eleanor remained a distant presence, as poised and composed as ever, but Mark felt like a ghost in her world. The terms of their contract were clear: no love, just an arrangement, and yet, the emptiness that hung over him only grew more pronounced as time passed. His role as her husband felt more like a performance, and the weight of pretending began to weigh heavily on his soul. One evening, after another tense dinner in the sprawling dining room, Eleanor spoke to him as she usually did, businesslike, detached, and precise. "Mark, we need to attend the shareholder meeting next week. It's crucial for the company's direction," she said, glancing at him briefly before returning to her papers. Mark nodded silently. This was his life now. Meetings, appearances, and a marriage without affection or connection. He had agreed to it, but every day that passed felt like he was losing more of himself. As the days went on, the pattern of his life became more and more unbearable. The mansion was beautiful, but cold. The meetings were productive, but hollow. Eleanor had built an empire, and she was determined to keep it that way: controlled, efficient, and free from any emotional attachment. And Mark? He was just a pawn in her game, a necessary accessory to her legacy. It wasn't until one quiet evening when Mark was walking through the manicured gardens that he realized how isolated he truly was. The air was crisp, and the soft rustling of the leaves only made the silence more profound. He sat on a bench, his mind racing. How had he gotten here? How had he become someone who simply existed without living? Eleanor had given him the stability he needed, but at what cost? His heart ached with the realization that he had sacrificed more than he ever intended to. The next morning, Mark returned to the mansion after a meeting with one of Eleanor's business partners. He was exhausted physically, mentally, and emotionally. He hadn't spoken to Eleanor in days, and each passing day felt like another reminder of the life he had lost. As he entered the living room, Eleanor was there, sitting by the fireplace with a glass of wine. She looked up as he approached, her eyes sharp and calculating as always. "Mark," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I know this isn't easy for you. But this is the life we've agreed on. The life you chose. You can't change it now." She paused, her gaze never leaving his. "And you don't have to do this alone. I'm here to make sure you have everything you need. Security. A future, that's what matters." Mark felt a knot tighten in his chest. Eleanor's words were logical, cold, and pragmatic. But there was no warmth, no care in her tone. She wasn't asking him to be happy, she was simply ensuring that he wouldn't fall apart. She had kept her end of the bargain, but what about him? Was this really the life he wanted? "I know," Mark replied quietly, his voice almost lost in the silence of the room. "But sometimes I wonder if I've made the wrong choice." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a long sip of her wine, her gaze thoughtful. Finally, she spoke. "You haven't made the wrong choice, Mark. Not if you want to keep your family's legacy intact. Not if you want a future free from debt and uncertainty. Mark nodded, though his heart didn't agree. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the security. It was about the emptiness that seemed to follow him everywhere. The loneliness in the grand mansion, the coldness between them, and the hollow feeling that nothing he did could ever fill. Later that night, as Mark lay in bed, he found himself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His mind wandered back to the life he had once imagined for himself. A life filled with purpose, ambition, and yes, even love. But now, everything felt distant, like a dream he could never reach. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the thoughts, but the feeling of being trapped in this carefully constructed world only grew stronger. He had made his choice, but the question lingered: was it worth it? The next morning, he received a call from Eleanor's lawyer, informing him of yet another business meeting. He dressed quickly, not wanting to delay the inevitable. But as he left the mansion, a small part of him wondered if this was the beginning of something else, something more. Could he ever escape this life? Or was he already too far gone to turn back? The days that followed felt like a blur, each one blending into the next. Mark continued to go through the motions, attending meetings, playing his part as Eleanor's husband, and living in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. He had told himself that this was for his family, that he had made the right choice. But every passing day only reinforced the feeling that he was losing himself in the process. He was stuck in a life that wasn't his own, surrounded by wealth and security, yet feeling emptier than ever. It was another evening when everything came to a head. Mark had just returned from yet another high-profile event, his mind clouded with a sense of dread and confusion. The mansion was silent, as it always was when he returned. Eleanor was in her office, working late as usual. He stood at the threshold of the room for a moment, watching her from afar. She was immersed in her work, her focus unshakable, and for a brief moment, Mark wondered if this was the life she wanted too, if this cold, detached existence was all there was. Finally, he gathered the courage to walk in. Eleanor looked up, her gaze piercing as always, but there was something different in the air tonight. She seemed to sense the shift in him before he even spoke. "Eleanor," Mark began, his voice steady but carrying a weight of unspoken emotions. "I think I've made a mistake." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with the truth that he had been avoiding for so long. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She simply studied him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something softer, almost vulnerable. "A mistake?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "What do you mean?" Mark took a deep breath, trying to put his emotions into words. "I've been living a life I thought I wanted. I thought security was enough. But it's not. I can't keep pretending, Eleanor. I can't keep living this way, disconnected from everything that matters." For a moment, Eleanor was silent. The room seemed to grow even colder, the weight of Mark's confession filling the space between them. Then, she stood up, her movements measured and deliberate. "What are you saying, Mark?" she asked softly, though there was a hard edge to her words. Mark swallowed, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. "I'm saying I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending that I don't want more. I want a real life. A real connection. And I know you don't want that. You've made it clear. But I can't live in this cold, empty house any longer." Eleanor's face tightened, but she didn't say anything for a long while. She looked away, staring out the window, her back to Mark. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a sadness in it that Mark hadn't heard before. "You're right," she said, her words soft and almost distant. "I never wanted anything more than what we've had. This arrangement was never about love. It was about control, about keeping the life I built secure." She turned back to him, her eyes meeting his for the first time with something like understanding. "But I'm not blind, Mark. I see what this is doing to you. And I can't keep asking you to live in a lie." Mark stood there, unsure of what to say. For the first time since they had met, Eleanor seemed human. She wasn't just the cold, calculating woman who had made him an offer. She was someone who had built her empire on her own, but had also been consumed by it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, almost to herself. "I never wanted to hurt you." Mark felt a wave of sadness wash over him. He had been so focused on escaping his past that he had failed to see the woman in front of him, the woman who had her own burdens to carry. She wasn't just the person who had offered him an escape, she was a person who, in her own way, had been just as lonely as he was. For a long moment, they stood in silence, each of them processing the weight of the situation. Finally, Mark spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "I think we need to let go. Both of us. You need to find what makes you happy, Eleanor. And I need to find my own way. It's not working. It was never going to work." Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "I understand," she said, her voice steady but heavy. "I wish you the best, Mark. You deserve happiness, too." Mark felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with sadness. He had made the right decision, but it wasn't easy. He had sacrificed so much for security, for a future that had promised so much, but in the end, it had given him nothing but emptiness. As Mark walked away from the mansion that night, he realized that this was the first step in rediscovering himself. The road ahead would be difficult, but it would be his own. And maybe, just maybe, it would lead him to the happiness he had been searching for all along. The end of one chapter was the beginning of another. And Mark knew that, this time, it would be different.